to Sunday, September 5th, 2021, mini worship of the Kemble Sarawak Zion Keppel Pastoral Charge. It's now Sunday afternoon of Labor Day weekend, and I hope you're all having a great weekend. We just finished having worship outside on the side lawn at Kemble Sarawak United Church, and it was a wonderful time together. We had the usual rooster in the yard beside us, cock-a-doodle-dooing, keeping us awake, making sure no one fell asleep during the sermon. We had lovely clouds floating overhead, a nice breeze. We had one of the neighborhood cats join us for worship, which was a kind of a thrill for us as well. And I'm really thankful for Fred and Mary Ellen, who played beautiful music through the whole service. And we even had some company. Some of the folks that were coming up to visit with friends decided to join us on the side lawn for our worship. So it was a nice time. This week what we did is we took a look at chapter 2 and 3 of the book of James. And in these two chapters we're being taught that there is certain levels of our faith and that we need to be self-aware of where we are in our faith. We kind of equated them to the Summer Olympics that we've just experienced this summer. That there are those athletes who are in the bronze, those in the silver, and those who are actually at the top at the gold. And the author of the book of James is telling us that there are sort of kind of different levels of our faith, and that our self-awareness of where we are in our faith really matters if we want to be able to have a life full of that which endures, such as peace and joy and wisdom. And so the very first kind of faith that is expressed in James chapter 2 and 3 is what we kind of classify as the bronze level of faith. And we learned today that this faith in the scriptures is called a dead faith. People with this kind of faith know the words, they know the actions, they know the walk, they talk the talk, but it doesn't actually amount to much of anything. Their faith is an intellectual faith, a practiced faith. That's kind of a performance that they know how to put on. They have never really submitted themselves to God, given over the control that God can have in our lives. They've never really leaned into trusting that God can actually provide. And sometimes God's wisdom prevails in situations where it just doesn't make sense at the time. Now, before you begin to list folks in your head who you think fit this category, stop and realize that we all fit into this category at some point in our lives. We only stay there if we're not wise enough to examine our own actions and our own words and to make sure that they match up with the integrity that we intend for them to. We kind of have to deliberately discipline ourselves to rise above the bronze standard of faith. We can grow in our faith, most importantly through self-awareness, through reading scriptures, by being in conversation with God, and being honest with ourselves, asking where it is we truly want to be with our faith, and how it is that we do experience God, or if we're honest with ourselves, or we don't. Now the next level of faith we learn about today is considered the silver standard of faith, because those in this level of faith have taken their faith one step further. I mean, no longer is their faith just an intellectual response, it's now an emotional response as well. And perhaps to shock us readers into some kind of compliance, the author of the book of James, he says that there are demons that are kind of in this silver stage of faith, that even the demons have this kind of faith, that they believe in God, and they even believe in the deity of Christ. And they even have an emotional response by believing and shuddering or trembling. But their response lacks one important element for it to be considered a gold standard of faith, and that's their will. The will to turn this faith into some kind of action, into some kind of works that produces goodness for others, that brings Christ's light to others through our life. And that is the gold standard of faith. True faith-saving actions that save, that includes the mind to understand, the heart to rejoice, and the will to act accordingly. The true gold standard of faith leads to actions and the will to be dedicated disciples. To live a life of gold standard faith is to live a life that has been changed by a personal relationship with God. I dare say that those who live in the bronze level of faith are usually much younger because they've been blessed with a good life. They've never had to face those dark, terrible times, difficult, mournful, grievous times when either the choice is to despair or to trust in God anyways. And then the silver is an area of faith where most of us fall into from time to time, where we know that we know that there's a God, we have faith in this God, but we still want to hang on to all the control we can of situations. We still want everything to make sense to us, so it adds up in our minds and our hearts. But this gold standard of faith, this is the standard of faith that takes a lot of discipline, a lot of stretching our belief, stretching our trust. It's the kind of faith that produces a lot of action in our lives. We start to act out in ways that others begin to look at us and say, now there's something different about that person. Because in this moment of despair, they should be despairing, and instead they're not. They're calm, they're peaceful, they're trusting. Or perhaps they'll say something to the effect of, there they are helping others when they themselves are carrying such a heavy burden. I know I've known people like that, who are going through such difficult times, and yet they still find a way to be there for others, to help others, to uphold others. Those are people that are living in this gold standard of faith. It's a dynamic faith, it is written in our scriptures, a faith of reaching out to others with a deep desire to not harm, but instead to be gentle and to be a loving presence in the world. It's having the courage to do what is right, even if it puts you against others. It's the courage to speak up even if your voice shakes. It's the courage to love the unlovable. It's the courage to do the right thing even if it's not the most popular thing. To illustrate, the author of James refers to two well-known people in the Bible who lived their lives at this gold standard of level. Those with faith that turned into life-giving actions for others. Those who lived this dynamic faith. Abraham and Rahab. But today I bet we can think of heroes in our own world now, or perhaps in your own personal life, those who you know that live this dynamic faith. And they may be very quiet people. Often they are. They're not the ones trying to get a lot of attention. They're just busy, trying to make the world a better place. One of my heroes is a woman whose name was Dorothy Day, and she lived back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. She passed away in the 1970s. And Dorothy Day, she went around and built homes down in the States, group homes, for those who were dealing with addictions, alcoholism, homelessness. And she did this out of her sense of what God was calling her to do. She did not have the support of the Catholic Church of which she belonged, and she did not have the support of the government. And she raised support by the publications that she produced and sort of spread out all over. And to this day, the social network, the nets that we have catching people, started with Dorothy Day and with her movement back during the Depression and in the 40s and the 50s. Those who returned after the wars and was struggling to make ends meet, struggling to get their feet back under them. Another one, of course, would be Mother Teresa, and another one, I think, is Pope Francis. I think Pope Francis speaks up against the church. He speaks up against the establishment. He speaks up and says what is true instead of what might make him popular. I quite admire him. And then in my own circle of friends, I can think of a few who very quietly but courageously go about making the world a better place, not so that they get the attention, but so that the world can be better for others. Our desire should be that God looks upon our lives and also sees a life that is being lived with this kind of integrity and discipleship of the gold standard. A life of dynamic faith would be amazing if God were to use us as an example. But there's something we have to be aware of. These passages from the book of James should come with a little bit of a warning label, because if misused, they can cause a lot of damage. It is imperative that we remember that the author of James was talking about our faith. He was asking us to take a look inside our souls and decide for ourselves a bit about self-awareness. But he was not talking about the nature of God at all. You see, God remains the same throughout time. God's love is unconditional, and we are never beyond God's gaze or God's presence, no matter how much we may mess up our faith journey. God is always present, offering us the opportunity to start afresh, to acknowledge our mistakes, to ask for forgiveness. And if we're sincere in our request, God will offer us a new beginning. We're so far from perfect. We can't expect to get this faith journey on the first swing. We have to redo things and go over things. We have to reevaluate. The good news is while we're finding our way, God is still loving us, and that won't change. The author of James is offering us in these 2 chapters wisdom on how to live lives of faith. He is challenging us to not only listen, but to act on that wisdom. Folks who live their lives in the bronze standard of faith, saying all the right words, showing up at the right events, but not really living life as a disciple, well, the good news is God still loves them, and God is still present in their lives. But most likely, they're not open enough to that presence to even know of it, to experience it, to feel it. Often life must seem overwhelming, and the world must feel like a cold and mean place to them. They must constantly be struggling with trying to control every situation. And then folks who live their life in the silver standard of faith, having both an intellectual and an emotional response to hymns, to prayers, to scriptures, but not the will to share this with others, and not the will to fully give over their lives to Christ. Well, the good news is God still loves them. The good news is God is still present with them. What isn't so great is how, in fact, their life isn't being lived within the things that endure, such as love and peace and hope. I suspect a lot of that times when we feel frustrated with the world, we feel sad with the world, it's because we kind of got stuck in this silver level of faith. We're not beyond God's love. We just may not be able to experience that love fully. We're not beyond God's gaze. We just maybe aren't able to quite lean into that and trust in that presence and that gaze. But lastly, and most importantly, the author of James would say to those who live a dynamic faith, a faith that puts to action the desire to serve God, that God loves them, that God is still present with them in their lives, of course. And here's the catch. They're able to feel that experience of God in their lives. They're able to witness that presence of God in their everyday life when they face challenges. They face them in a different way because they have within them that which endures: wisdom and peace, trust and hope. They're able to go into these dark chapters, which we all go through: grief, ill health, job problems, pandemics that seem to go on forever, trusting in the fact that there is a God who is much bigger than any of those problems, a God who is writing the story, a God who will show them a way through the wilderness and into a better place, and a God who then whispers to them, now go and share this love and this peace and this wisdom with others. For when we share it with others, it makes ours even more richer. People living in this gold level of faith, they understand that. And I think it is our aim to live life in this gold level of faith. And sometimes we get sideways. Sometimes we kind of get slipped off and we don't know we're no longer on that pathway. But that's where these 2 chapters in James help us, because they encourage us to be self-aware. They encourage us to pause and ask questions about our faith. They encourage us to be challenged, that we may actually live the life of faith that would be fulfilling. I'd like to end with this beautiful poem, a prayer by Augustus. Give me the love that leads the way, the faith that nothing can dismay, the hope no disappointments can tire, the passion that will burn like fire. Let me not sink to be a clod. Make me thy fuel, flame of God. Amen. I know it was kind of a tricky passage to go through, and I do hope that there was something good there that helped you today as we head into this new chapter of Pandemic Living 2021. Tuesday with the return of school, and many people, almost everyone, will be returning to their workplaces. And so as you go forth into this new chapter, may you go knowing that you're not alone. May you go questioning your faith so that it may grow stronger. And may you go with joy, and may you share that joy with everyone. We'll see you next week.